Godt. Så er klokken jo faktisk rundet 2. Skal vi være helt tjekket og starte sharp, så bliver vi måske nok lige lidt forstyrret, når folk de kommer indenfor. Hej Henrik, velkommen til. Men jeg vil da gerne sige rigtig hjertelig velkommen til det første spadestik i EduConf.dk's forhåbentlig lange historie. Først og fremmest så vil jeg gerne sige tak til Østerfrøj Skole, fordi at I har lagt lokaler til. Det var Josefine, som var så sød at invitere og sige, ej, vi holder det der herude på min skole. Og Kirsten, hun sprang på med det samme, med meget kort varsel, og sagde, det kan I da selvfølgelig. Jeg hedder Pernille Palme. Hov. Det var ikke den. Og jeg er lærer ude i Lyngby-Taarbæk Kommune, men jeg holder orlov lige på tiden for at fordybe mig i det her spændende område med tablets i undervisningen. Og i den forbindelse har jeg taget initiativ til det, jeg kalder EduConf.dk, som jeg håber på kan vokse sig til at blive en konference om tabletbaseret undervisning. Få af jer har jo været med fra den første invitation, hvor jeg uden så sådan her ud. Der var det sådan et halvdags konferenceprogram fra 13 til 18.30. Og jeg fik desværre ikke helt nok tilmeldinger. Og så har jeg pivoteret rundt, indtil jeg kunne finde et format, der kunne tiltrække jer. Og nu sidder vi her, og jeg er rigtig glad for det. Jeg håber på, at det kan blive en tilbagevendende konference, som kan være platform for alle os, som er interesseret i det her område, så vi kan få inspiration til vores undervisning, og så vi kan videndele med hinanden. Det ser jeg som en af de mest centrale i 21st century skills. Det er jo, at vi både som undervisere og som elever skal blive gode til at dele med hinanden og tappe af hinandens ressourcer. I forbindelse med, at jeg har været stablet det her på benene, har jeg også været ude og lave en lille undersøgelse for at se, hvor vi egentlig står henne lige nu med at få implementeret tablets ude på skolerne. Så jeg har lavet et survey på 70 skoler, har jeg været ude på personligt. Og det har været spændende og interessant. Det er kun sådan den kvantitative del af det, jeg har fået bearbejdet indtil videre, så I er stadigvæk velkomne til at bidrage med kvalitativ feedback. Jeg kan altid lige komme og få et link til surveyet, så kan vi arbejde videre. Jeg har været i 8 kommuner i Københavnsområdet. Der er blandt Københavns Kommune. Jeg har ikke været på samtlige skoler i Københavns Kommune. Der er mange. Der er også 65 eller sådan noget. Men det jeg sådan har fundet ud af kort i tal lige her først, det er, at 3 af de 8 kommuner, jeg har været i, de satser simpelthen på en en-til-en løsning med tablet. Så der har alle samtlige lærere og elever og på alle skoler i kommunen fået udleveret en tablet. Og alle de kommuner og skoler, jeg har været i kontakt med, de har valgt iPads. Jeg ved jo fra rygte, at der findes andet derude, men jeg har simpelthen ikke mødt noget så meget som en Surface eller nogle af de andre mærker. Hvilket jo er mærkeligt, når man tænker på, hvor meget billigere de er. 72% af de skoler, jeg har været på, bruger tablets i et eller andet omfang. 28% gør ikke. Og der er selvfølgelig stor spredning på, hvor mange der findes på de forskellige skoler. 27%, næsten en tredjedel, har en-til-en på hele skolen. Mens 28% har valgt at fokusere på en klasse eller en årgang, og så tage det som forsøgsordning og se, hvordan det bærer videre derfra. Og 35% har valgt at lave klassesæt til udlån. Så det ikke sådan bliver den måde, som Steve Jobs i hvert fald, eller de første tænkte apparatet som et personligt device. Og så er der noget spændende, at 25% har valgt at starte i specialundervisning. Det synes jeg jo er lidt interessant, og det bliver spændende at se den kvalitative del, hvad de synes om det. Men min fornemmelse er, at det er noget, der virker. At det både motiverer og inspirerer og letter indlæringen for mange af de elever. Så var jeg lige til et arrangement i går, hvor jeg talte med en hemmelig kilde hos Apple, som sagde, at vi faktisk er oppe på 20 kommuner nu, som har over 1.500 tablets. Altså det var så iPads selvfølgelig, det var Apple, der sagde det. 1.500 iPads i kommunen. Det synes jeg er ret meget. Så man må sige, det er på vej. Det er her nok for at blive. Ligesom det der internet noget. Så det var nogle af tallene, men hvad er det kan bruges til? Og hvad er det kan gøre for vores undervisning og vores klasserum? Så var jeg lige så heldig at støde på en rapport om den nye e-bog Tavs, der lige er kommet ud her for ganske få dage siden. Hvor der stod sådan en smuk sætning her, at digital fortælling og de her multimodale tekster, hvor video og billede og lyd bliver blandet med tekst, at det giver jo en øget læseappel, og det hjælper på fiktionsforståelsen hos eleverne, og det får flere børn til at læse. Og det er jo noget, jeg tror alle, som har siddet med børn og tablets og set den der interaktion, og det har vi jo oplevet længe, men nu er der simpelthen også nogen, der har skrevet det ned. And now I'll switch to English, because now I'm approaching the subject that we're going to talk about today. Because I also stumbled upon, that's an older research study done in Denmark as well in 2008, where Rikke Magnussen investigated how students interacted with the game Homicide. She was looking into how social studies and science skills could be improved by playing these games. And she found these two phenomenal sentences. I'm just going to read them aloud. The ability to construct, productively use, transform, and critique visual representations as an integrated part of doing inquiry into defining an unknown phenomenon. It includes the ability to visually represent the phenomena subjected to inquiry and the inquiry strategies that go into investigating the phenomenon, and the ability to construct and use representation for investigating, coordinating, and relating evidence, hypotheses, and theory. I sincerely hope that you're not going to be speaking to us in those kinds of terms, Mike. I think we might be able to process small, bite-sized information. And that was a pun intended. So with no further ado, I think that means that you can actually learn something from playing science games. Am I right? So, with no further ado, let me introduce Mr. Mike Lee.
Hi. I can't read that sentence. I have no idea what any of that says or means.
You need this one.
Yeah, I do.
Måske. Are you on? Sådan.
Good, great. Okay. So, my name is Mike Lee, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and who I am, how I came to be here. Then, ultimately, we're going to get into the story of this game that I made, the types of games that I'm trying to make. But more generally, some of the thoughts that I've had about education and technology in the more general sense. Because I spend a lot of time thinking about education and technology, and because I'm not an educator, I'm an engineer, and as an engineer, I find that the best way for me to build my domain-specific knowledge in areas outside of my expertise is to say what I think I know to people who know better, and then have a conversation with them. So, I hope that this will not simply be me telling you about technology, but you also telling me a little bit about technology. I expect to be at least partially wrong, and I appreciate your patience in that regard. So, who am I and why am I here in the first place? Gosh, my story starts actually in labor at a company called Alaska Airlines in Seattle, where I somehow ended up. And labor is what I was born for, according to the schools that I went to, because I'm big and because I'm dumb. Those are the big things. I said I couldn't read that sentence. I wasn't kidding. I cannot read that sentence. I cannot parse something that complicated in one sitting. I have severe, severe ADHD. When I was in high school, I would actually pass out from the effort of trying to read. That's how bad it is. And I, was educated by a group of people who didn't think that was a real condition and didn't, know how to deal with it, and really were not equipped. So I barely graduated from high school. Mostly, it's just that I would not do anything over the year, and then at the end of the year, when the stress was sufficiently high that I could sit down and concentrate for a couple of days, do enough work to barely pass. I eventually dropped out of college because I couldn't afford it, and I'm an American, and that's a thing. So what I did was I lifted things for a living, and that job was pretty dangerous and very stressful. But it was so dangerous and so stressful that it enabled me to concentrate well enough to learn how to program a computer and start making software for the airline. Oddly enough, I started making training software to teach people how to do the job that I had been doing better, and all the other jobs at the airline. And eventually, it was deemed important enough, like when they ran the test of the first piece of software I made for them, it saved them $1 million as an annual recurring cost. And that was just the test. Because, airlines are expensive businesses, and because education is important. That enabled me to actually get a job writing software, and I actually left that job despite the fact that it was the first white collar, as we say, job that I actually had. Left that job to try to go and do more, to do better, because when I started making software, I was inspired by how other people made software better than me, and I wanted to learn more about that. So I went to a company called Delicious Monster, which you've probably never heard of. They're like a really tiny company. But they're kind of the people who invented apps as you think of them now. The transformative way that an app takes a piece of hardware and is not just merely some window on a desktop, but is actually transforming that into an object of utility, that's invented at Delicious Monster by a guy named Mike Mattis, who then went to Apple and then went to Facebook. So for example, if you think about how you organize a collection of media, you probably think of something like pictures of books and media sitting on kind of virtual wooden bookshelves. They invented that. That's where that came from. That's what I mean. We made Mac software. We won awards from Apple, and we were pretty well known and pretty wealthy from doing so before the iPhone ever came out. So I'm like that rare person who actually made software for Apple before iPhone was a thing that existed. Which doesn't seem like anything to me, but really impresses the hell out of some people. So when the iPhone came out, I moved from Seattle, where I'd been living. I grew up in Hawaii, where the education system is terrible. I moved to Seattle, where it's better. And then I moved to California, where it's terrible. And awesome, depending on if you have money or not. Made a game called Tap Tap Revenge, which is the very first iPhone game to ever have 1 million downloads. Actually, it was the very first iPhone app to ever have 1 million downloads, but our next door neighbors at Facebook claimed that they had 1 million downloads before they actually did, so everybody thinks it was them, but they're liars. And assholes. That was eventually acquired by Disney, and then I started my own company called United Lemur. You'll notice a trend. I like lemurs. Talk to me about lemurs later. United Lemur was not around for very long. We made the first, and as far as I know, only cash contest to ever run on the App Store. So back in 2008, we made a game that was a puzzle, and the puzzle was super hard, and if you were the first person to solve the puzzle, you won money, actual money. The actual winner got 8,000 actual dollars, and then they banned that. They're like, no more of that. That was 2008. There was this thing about the economy in 2008 you probably are aware of, where everything fell apart. Mm-hmm. And also, software used to be a thing that you would pay money for and you could make a living, and that also ended in 2008. So that was when we saw the price of software basically drop to where it is now, where the average cost of an app is about 50 cents. Then I went to go work at Apple, because I needed a job, because software was selling for an average cost of 50 cents. And that was awesome. If you ever wondered if working at Apple was awesome, working at Apple was awesome. But I wanted more, better. And so I was actually inspired by this mathematician named Paul Erdos, who was like homeless and was like basically a bum. And he would just like go around and like slum on people's couches. But he also wrote more mathematical papers than anyone in history. And every mathematician can tell you how many degrees of separation they are from Paul Erdos. And I thought, what an interesting dude. I would love to do something like that. And so I basically got rid of everything and did nothing but travel for about a year. Spoke at conferences, met people, did these sorts of things. This is how I got to know the folks at Trifork from stuff like this. Eventually I settled down in Amsterdam, where I live now. And I wanted to work at a company called SOFA. And SOFA is like a really well-known company for basically taking the world's most boring problems and solving them in like the best possible way. Like they make a point-of-sale software that is so good that it's like I want to have a store so I can use their point-of-sale software. That's how excited I am about point-of-sale, even though point-of-sale is like the most boring problem ever, right? Very, very, very incredible company made out of very incredible people who were then bought by Facebook and ceased to exist because Mark Zuckerberg has to buy friends. So instead, my partner Judy and I, who's over there, started a nonprofit organization called Amsterdam with the intended goal of basically helping technologists and helping people who are disrupted by technology. Because as someone who makes technology, I don't want you guys to come smash the looms and burn my office, so I want to help you guys figure out technology. And it's not just teachers, right? Teachers, but also like publishers, journalism, which was my major. A lot of industries are being disrupted right now, right? And like this is the ultimate thing and why I'm here. It's not that you want tablets in your classroom. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's that you have tablets in your classroom and you're gonna have to deal with it in the best possible way. And that's why I'm here. And then after, that's been running now for 3 years, going strong, nonprofit, all good, but the whole point was to kind of build an ecosystem for app makers to operate in, and so I eventually had to go back to the actual job of engineering, and that brings me to where I am today at a company called the new Lemurs, as opposed to the old Lemurs, and we are making what I like to call experimental games. Really, we're making educational games, but not in the sense that you usually think of when you think of educational games. Making educational games has taught me a lot about education, and that brings us to today. Here's the thing about educational games, and what fundamentally we're trying to do differently than how it's always been done. Educational games, they need to compete as games. They need to be the best games on the market, right? Right now, you have games that are acceptable for what they are because they're educational, and they are made by people who know that they can get away with things because they're educational and because they are serving a specific market, and they're not necessarily made to be the most fun games in the world. I once got to speak at Stanford. It's always an honor to speak at a school that you could never have gone to yourself. And I was speaking to a room full of teachers who had basically left pedagogy in order to become app makers because they wanted to learn how to make educational software. And they found it very difficult to make educational software, especially games, because games are really hard. And I ended up having this, well, it wasn't meant to be an argument, but it kind of turned into an argument with this gentleman who had, he'd been in teaching for longer than I'd been in software. And his game was boring as hell and terrible. It's terrible. And I was trying to explain why the game was terrible, right? And fundamentally, the problem with his game was that there were just too many words everywhere, so many words. And I said, you need to get rid of the words, right? Too many words. And he's like, how am I supposed to teach kids to read without using words? And I was like, I don't know, but you need to figure it out because Grand Theft Auto doesn't have words and Grand Theft Auto is winning, right? And that's the thing, is that your competition, right, if you're making educational software, your competition is not Reader Rabbit and Mavis Beacon, your competition is Grand Theft Auto, right? Your competition is Candy Crush. Your competition is fundamentally evil, and you are competing for the souls of children. It's not to be taken lightly. The other thing is that I've learned about what games actually are, and I actually found this surprising and then not surprising. Which is this. A game, if you break a game down, a game breaks down atomically into a series of what are called ludines. A ludeme is a piece of knowledge that is learned, right? Is a thing that you master. And the way that this works is your brain loves to learn things. And when it learns things, it gives you this little hit, of dopamine or whatever, and it just, ooh, that feels good, right? And learning turns out to be super awesome. And gaming works because it makes you learn, and in making you learn, it makes your brain happy. And it becomes addictive, right? It becomes fun. And games are fun because learning is fun, and yet education, which is pure learning, is almost never fun. What is up with that? How is that possible, right? How is it possible that you break a game down, it's nothing but learning, but then if you take a bunch of learning and you put it together, it's not a game? I think it comes down to the kind of people who teach and the kind of people who do things that are fun. No offense, you guys. But these are the educators and these are the entertainers, and there is very little overlap here. I don't know how many of you get in front of a classroom and consider it to be like a second career to your stand-up comedy career. Probably none of you. But I think that if you did see it that way, you would probably be more effective at keeping the kids interested, right? But that's hard. Like, yeah, great. Go out and become stand-up comics in addition to everything else you have to do, right? Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Realistically, that's not going to happen. So what do we do when this is so small that you can name these people by name, right? Like John Green is a man who is both an educator and an entertainer, right? So what do you do when this is such a small number of people is you invite John Green into your classroom or into the lives of your students, because at the end of the day, the nice thing about technology is it doesn't have to happen in the classroom, right? It can happen whenever, wherever. And so I want to introduce you to John Green, who you may not know, and some of my other favorite teachers. John Green, of course, he's on YouTube and he has a bunch of things that he does. One of my favorites is a thing called Crash Course. They do both the sciences. His brother does the sciences. He does the humanities. And I want to show you one of these Crash Course videos. This one in literature. I really want to show you.
Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to.
Excuse me, John. I really want to show you this one because this is about Oedipus Rex. I'm sure you're all familiar with Oedipus Rex, the story, right? Oedipus, King Oedipus.
We know him.
You know him a little bit? Well, if you don't, it's super classic, right? Classic Greek, like Oedipus. There you go. Yeah, yeah.
It's because of the pronunciation.
Exactly, right. This is something that I have a feeling is taught all over the Western world, and I think that all of us feel like we know the story and we have a pretty good handle on what it's about. And yet, when I watched this video, I learned so much, not just about this story, but about everything. And that's why I'm excited. That's why I want to show it to you. All right, John, take it away.
Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to Crash Course Literature. Today we're going to talk about Oedipus. Leo Tolstoy once famously wrote that all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I certainly hope that there's no family as unhappy as Oedipus's. Ancient Greek playwrights really specialized in the dysfunctional family. I mean, they have plays about wives killing husbands, parents killing children, children killing parents, siblings killing each other, and they also wrote tragedies. But it's hard to imagine a more tragic, dysfunctional family than the Theban clan that Sophocles writes about in Oedipus the King. I mean, except for the Kardashians. Mr. Green, you heard the Kardashians. That sounds exotic. Is it something from Star Wars? Oh yeah, me from the past. You don't know about the Kardashians. Right now, to you, the only Kardashian you know is O.J. Simpson's defense attorney. Anyway, don't worry about it. Just imagine a green light on the other side of the bay that represents the glory you'll never reach. That's the Kardashians. Okay, so Oedipus is king of Thebes, having solved the riddle of the Sphinx and saved the city from destruction, but now a plague is devastating Thebes, and various oracles and bird entrails suggest it's because the murderer of the old king, Laius, still lives there unpunished. Oedipus decides to investigate the murder, only to discover that, mind blown, he is the one who killed Laius and married his queen, Jocasta. Then he finds out that Laius was actually his father, and Jocasta is his mother, so he's had 4 children with his mom, fulfilling an earlier prophecy because bird entrails are never wrong. It's the old accidentally kill your father, accidentally marry your mother plot. It goes way back. Freud can tell you a lot about it at Crash Course Psychology. Anyway, Jocasta hangs herself and Oedipus gouges out his own eyes with her jewelry, then goes into exile. In subsequent plays, his 2 sons murder each other and one of his daughters commits suicide. So, you know, it could have gone better. So for a little context, theater was a really big deal to the Greeks. I mean, if you were a male citizen, not a woman, not a slave, attending it was your civic duty. It was sort of like voting, except that it began with ritual animal sacrifice, so it was really nothing like voting. But this civic duty aspect is interesting because a lot of the plays ask really troubling questions about power and control and the wisdom of rulers. Like, playwrights masked their commentary by setting plays in earlier mythic eras or in foreign lands, just like Shakespeare did. But they were quite provocative then, and what's most important is that the best of them are still interesting now. 3 playwrights would each present 4 plays, a cycle of 3 related tragedies, and then a satyr play, which would be funny and often involved enormous phalluses and or poop jokes. Citizens would watch play after play while judges would determine a winner. So it was kind of like Sundance or Cannes, but again with the ritual animal sacrifice, and there was no multi-million-dollar theatrical distribution deals. You know, but there was glory. Unfortunately, we only have a small portion of these plays today. Many were lost over the millennia, including some that were destroyed at the burning of the Library of Alexandria. In Sophocles' day, the cast was made of 3 male actors, some of whom took on multiple roles, and also a chorus. Playwrights were typically the director, the composer, the set designer, and often also the lead actor, although apparently Sophocles did not appear in his plays because he was, I guess, a terrible actor. But the choruses were drawn from the Athenian citizenry and generally served as like stand-ins for the audience, asserting conventional wisdom and asking the questions that a typical audience member might. The actors wore masks that were made of linen and hair, as well as enormous robes and platform sandals, so you could still see them even if you were in the cheap seats. So Sophocles lived throughout nearly all of the 5th century BCE, and he wrote 123 plays. We have 7. Who knows what kind of crazy stuff people got up to in the other ones. The first person to offer literary criticism of Greek drama was my old nemesis Aristotle, whom you'll remember was wrong about everything. This was a guy who believed that people were naturally born to slavery, except that he was actually kind of right about a lot of theater stuff. It pains me to say this because I do genuinely despise him, but Aristotle had a lot of interesting ideas about story. For instance, he noticed that in a lot of stories, the main character has a recognition and a reversal. He's also responsible for a lot of classical ideas about tragedy and comedy, and Oedipus fits his definition of tragedy very well, probably because it was his favorite play. Aristotle defines tragedy as, quote, an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. Tragedy is also meant to evoke both pity and fear. I mean, when Oedipus returns at the play's end wearing a new mask that shows his gouged out eyes, you feel bad for him. You also feel afraid. But here's the tricky part. Aristotle wrote that tragedy should afflict a mostly good character who makes a big mistake. I mean, it can't be about a bad character because then you don't feel any pity. And it can't be about a perfect character who does everything right and still suffers a tragic end because, 1, that wouldn't be very satisfying, and 2, it would imply that the universe doesn't reward goodness and punish evil, which is kind of a terrifying thought. So instead, it has to be about a good guy afflicted with a hamartia or a hamartia, depending on how pretentious you are. This word is sometimes mistranslated, including by the protagonist of my novel, The Fault in Our Stars, available in bookstores everywhere, as a tragic flaw. But actually, it's a term from archery that means you aim for the bullseye, but you miss. Now, I would argue that in the 2,500 years since Oedipus, there have been some very good tragedies that evoke fear and pity without the argument that the universe is interested in the lives of individuals. But, you know, this is the classical definition. So could Oedipus really... Uh-oh, my desk disappeared. That means it's time for the open letter. Hey there, Chewbacca. An open letter to the tragic hero, a type of character, of course, exemplified by Chewbacca. He was a Wookiee. He was strong, he was loyal, he was a great man, or at least a great Wookiee. But it was his loyalty, a desirable trait, that also ultimately made him, kind of a complicated hero. I mean, Chewbacca made a blood oath to Han Solo, so if you mess with Han Solo, Chewbacca's gonna rip your arms off. And for those of you who know the Star Wars universe outside the movies, you already know that eventually that does prove tragic. Chewbacca, you're a hero, but it's your heroism that also was ultimately your undoing. Best wishes, John Green. So is Oedipus a good character, and does he make a great mistake? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. So at the beginning of the play, Oedipus definitely seems like an A++ king. I mean, the priest calls him the first of men in all the chances of this life. When the priest comes to tell him about the suffering in the city, Oedipus says he knows about it already. I have known the story before you told it. Oedipus is already worried about what's happening to his people. In fact, he's dispatched his brother-in-law Creon to visit an oracle and find out the source of the pestilence. And let's not forget that Oedipus has already saved the city once by answering the riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx had the body of a woman, the wings of an eagle, and a really bad temper. She had a habit of killing everyone who answered her riddle incorrectly. So, I mean, you know, it takes a measure of courage to try to answer the riddle. He's a good guy, he's a great king, right? Yeah. I mean, when Creon gives answers that Oedipus doesn't like, Oedipus accuses him of plotting against him. He also has some harsh words for the blind seer Tiresias when Tiresias correctly names Oedipus as the source of the contagion. When the shepherd is brought to Oedipus and resists revealing the truth of Oedipus's birth because he knows it will upset the king, Oedipus threatens the man with torture. Then there's the ambiguity of missing the mark. I mean, what was Oedipus's error in this play? Was it killing Laius at the crossroads? I mean, that's maybe a little bit aggressive, but Sophocles makes it pretty clear that Laius had some chariot-era road rage and Oedipus was acting in self-defense. Was it sleeping with Jocasta? Well, that's pretty icky, but again, not really a choice. She was presented to him along with the kingdom when he defeated the Sphinx, and as we've said, he treats other characters pretty shabbily, but those are small mistakes rather than great ones. Maybe his mistake is believing he can outrun or escape his own fate, but if you were told you were going to murder your father and marry your mother, wouldn't you try to escape it? Now maybe you're thinking, well, if I heard a prophecy that I was going to be a father killer and a mother, I would, avoid fights with older men and sex with older women. And fair enough, but remember, Laius and Jocasta had attempted to kill Oedipus. They received a prophecy about this too. So Oedipus was brought up by the king and queen of Corinth, who he assumed were his parents. How is it a mistake to stay very far away from your parents and in the process save the city of Thebes? And if you can't outrun your fate, how is your fate a result of your flaws? So the play depends a lot on ironies. The guy who seems the smartest is actually the most ignorant. The man who saved Thebes is actually the one destroying it. Enlightenment leads to literal blindness. But that, combined with the aforementioned ambiguity, is a lot of what's made the play so enjoyable to so many generations of people. We in the audience are aware of all these ironies in a way that no one on stage is, at least until the very end. Remember how Oedipus says, "I have known the story before you told it"? Well, just about everyone in the audience also knows the story before it's told. I mean, you probably knew the outlines of this story before you actually read the play, right? The gap between what we know in the audience and what the characters know on stage makes us uncomfortable and scared for them, and it ratchets up the tension. Oedipus is a detective story where it turns out the detective is the murderer, and the detective doesn't know it, but the reader does. So with each new scene, with each new clue, the net draws more and more tightly around Oedipus. Every time a messenger comes with supposedly good news, hey, the king of Corinth is dead. Hey, the king of Corinth wasn't your father. Oedipus is led closer to the truth of his own guilt. And at several points, Jocasta tries to persuade Oedipus not to inquire further, but Oedipus can't help himself. He wants to know the whole story. For me, at least, that's what's admirable about him, and also what's pitiable. The play asks whether knowing is a good thing. I mean, Tiresias says, "Alas, how terrible is wisdom when it brings no profit to the man that's wise." And Oedipus, at least personally, probably would have been happier living in ignorance, although then the plague would have continued to devastate Thebes. So I think the play ultimately suggests that even though ignorance can be bliss, Oedipus's search for truth is right and just and brave and uncompromising, and that's what makes him great. It's also what ruins his life. As the critic E.R. Dodds says, what causes his ruin is his strength and courage, his loyalty to Thebes, and his loyalty to the truth. And so finally, thankfully, I do find myself disagreeing with Aristotle, because I don't think that Oedipus was a great man ruined by a great error. I think the story is more complicated than that. So could Oedipus ever really have escaped his fate? Probably not. I mean, there are occasional examples in Greek myth of gods softening a fate or finding a loophole. But those are rare. So when you read Oedipus, you realize there are actually two stories. One is about what's already happened, and one is about what's happening now. It's the second one that interests Sophocles, like killing the father and marrying the mother. That stuff happens in the past, off stage. Sophocles concentrates on the choices that Oedipus freely makes to find the source of the plague even when it means implicating himself, to gouge out his eyes so that he won't have to look at his parents in the underworld. So Oedipus can't escape his fate, but he does have a measure of free will. He does make some choices. What's interesting to Sophocles isn't so much the fulfillment of the prophecy as how it is fulfilled and how that affects the present. As the critic A.W. Gomes put it, the gods know what the final score of the football game will be, but we still have to play it. Ultimately, the victory, Gomes says, will depend on the skill, the determination, the fitness of the players, and a little on luck. Instead of using the play to stage some sort of fate versus free will debate, Sophocles is interested in asking questions of both fate and free will. I mean, when we see Oedipus, we should ask ourselves, how much control do we have over our lives? How much do we owe to genetics, to privilege, to upbringing, to accident, to the choices that we do or don't make? And those are relevant questions today. Now, of course, not everyone thought that was the most interesting part of the play. Like Sigmund Freud decided that the reason the play was so successful is because everyone suffers from a so-called Oedipus complex. Freud described this in the interpretation of dreams as the fate to direct our first sexual impulse toward our mother and our first hatred and our first murderous wish against our father. But for the record, Oedipus does not have an Oedipus complex. His tragedy is about a man who deliberately tries to avoid killing his father and impregnating his mother, not about a man who secretly wants to. But ultimately, what makes Oedipus such a great play is that it stands up to many readings and can inform our lives in many ways. I mean, is he a great man? Does he make a great mistake? Does he suffer his fate because of personal flaws or because of the nature of the universe? Those are big, interesting questions, and it's nice to know that people have been asking them for millennia. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is made with the help of...
I have had a lot of literature professors. Some have been really good and some have been really terrible, and none of them have ever been as good as John Green, right? Like, I've watched every video this guy puts out because they're interesting, because they make me understand not just what he's trying to teach, but also why, right? Why study literature in the first place, right? It ties together with psychology. It ties together with the human condition. I mean, it's a kind of education that I imagine most educators aspire to. And the nice thing about technology is that it allows us to distill all of that into something that you can just go out and just look at on the internet, right? Like, I think of an app as being a lot of people's work at solving a problem that is then distilled into something that can be passed around and used, and I think that this is the same thing for education. And the fact that you don't need to be John Green because you have John Green, right? And he's just one, right? He's just one. And I think that ultimately the lesson of John Green, if you will, is that what makes good entertainment also makes good education, right? That which is entertaining is also not necessarily educational, but geared up to be educational, right? So, for example, I think that anything that is good entertainment will have a kind of storytelling aspect of it, right? It's going to be relatable. It's going to be something that you yourself can see yourself in, that you yourself can tie together with your life. Like, what makes the story of Oedipus, as explained by John Green, so interesting to me is that I can actually relate to that, right? Before, I could never have related to Oedipus, right? Not my thing. But that is something I can relate to, right? This idea of the tragic hero, this definition from archery of like shooting at something and missing the mark. I have heard that so many times, right? Since being in Europe, like this fundamental difference between European cultures and American cultures is that Americans fire arrows all over the goddamn place. We have no problem missing the mark, right? But this idea of if I fire, I will miss, and if I miss, that's it for me. That is something that seems very, very European to me. It seems like something that really kind of holds us back, right? Because I'm now among you. And I think that storytelling storytelling is super important. Relating to things is super important. Being able to personally relate to something is super important. But more than that, I think that the pacing of it is what becomes important. And this to me, I think, is where the idea of an educational curriculum fails. Because you will maybe speak to one student in the class. Everyone else is either bored or lost because it's either moving too fast or it's moving too slow, right? This to me is the fundamental problem. And this to me is what education, or rather what technology enables us to solve in education, is it enables you to not merely have what the curriculum prescribes as the proper pace and content of something. You have every great and passionate teacher in the world who is providing a different way of looking at things and a different pace so that every student can continue to look at different things until they get it. That, I think, is the promise of technology in education. We'll get back to that. And finally, the fun aspect of it, right? I mean, John Green is fun. Crash Course is fun. They are entertaining videos, and fun is addictive. Right? I get to the end of one of those videos, and I want to watch another one. And that's a really, that's a class, right? That's like a classroom. You've got the whole setup. And yes, it's a very dynamic classroom, but it's fundamentally a classroom, and that is fundamentally a course on literature. They have a course on psychology, and a course on history, and a course on chemistry, and so on and so forth. But it's not only the things that are meant to be like a teacher in front of a class. I mean, YouTube in particular is full of things that are interesting and educational, but educational merely for the sake of being entertaining. I think that the most telling example in this case is an actual teacher, this guy by the name of CGP Grey. CGP Grey is super, super popular on YouTube. And he just talks about whatever. So I live, like I said, in Amsterdam, and that causes a lot of confusion with people. And CGP Grey has a great little summary of it.
Welcome to the great nation of Holland, where the tulips grow, the windmills turn, the breakfast is chocolatey, the people industrious, and the sea tries to drown it all. Except this country isn't Holland. It's time for the difference between Holland, the Netherlands, and a whole lot more. The correct name for this tulip-growing, windmill-building, hagelslag-eating, container ship-moving, ocean-conquering nation is the Netherlands. But confusion is understandable. The general region has been renamed a lot over 1,000 years, including as the Dutch Republic, the United States of Belgium, and the Kingdom of Holland. But it's not just history that makes this country's name confusing, because the Netherlands is divided into 12 provinces. Groningen, Drenthe, Overijssel, Gelderland, Limburg, Noord-Brabant, Zeeland, which, by the way, is the Zeeland that makes this Zeeland new, Friesland, with adorable little hearts on its flags, Flevoland, Utrecht, and here's the confusion, North Holland and Zuid-South Holland. These provinces make calling the Netherlands Holland like calling the United States Dakota. Though unlike the Dakotas, which are mostly empty, save for the occasional jackalope, the two Hollands are the most populated provinces and have some of the biggest attractions like Amsterdam and Kopenhagen. Chances are, if it's Dutch and you've heard of it, it's in one of the Hollands. Even the government's travel website for the country is holland.com, officially because it sounds friendlier, but unofficially it's probably what people are actually searching for. Confusion continues because people who live in the Hollands are called Hollanders, but all citizens of the Netherlands are called Dutch, as is their language. But in Dutch they say, Nederlands spreken de Nederlanders in Nederland, which sounds like they'd rather we call them Netherlanders speaking Netherlandish. Meanwhile, next door in Germany, they're Deutsche sprechen Deutsch in Deutschland, which sounds like they'd rather be called Dutch. This linguistic confusion is why Americans call the Pennsylvania Dutch Dutch, even though they're Germans. To review, this country is the Netherlands, its people are Dutch, and they speak Dutch. There is no country called Holland, but there are provinces of North and South Holland. Got it? Great, because it's about to get more complicated. The Netherlands is part of a kingdom with the same name, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, which is headed by the Dutch royal family. The Kingdom of the Netherlands contains 3 more countries, and to find them we must sail from the icy North Sea to the Caribbean and Aruba, Curacao, and St. Martin. These are no territories, but self-governing countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and as such they have their own governments and their own currencies. Geography geek side note here, while Aruba and Curacao are islands, St. Martin is just the southern half of a tiny island, also named St. Martin, the other half of which is occupied by France, and also named St. Martin. So despite being separated by Belgium on the European map, the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the French Republic share a border on the other side of the world on an island so nice they named it thrice. But why does the Kingdom of the Netherlands reach to the Caribbean anyway? Because empire. In the 1600s, the Dutch, always looking to expand business, laid their hands on every valuable port they could. For a time, America's east coast was New Netherland with its capital city of New Amsterdam. There was New Zealand, as mentioned previously, and nearby, the King of the Islands, New Holland. Though the empire is gone, these 3 Caribbean nations remain. And while 4 countries in one kingdom isn't unheard of, it doesn't stop there, because the country of the Netherlands also extends its borders to the Caribbean and 3 more islands: Bonaire, St. Eustatius, and Saba. These are not countries in a kingdom, but are cities in the country of the Netherlands, and they look the part. Residents of these far-flung cities vote in elections with the Dutch government just as any Hollander would, though weirdly they don't belong to any province, and they don't use the Dutch currency of euros. They use dollars instead. It's kind of like if Hawaii wasn't a state, but technically part of the District of Columbia, all the while using yen. These cities of the country of the Netherlands and these countries in the Kingdom of the Netherlands are together known as the Dutch Caribbean, and their citizens are Dutch citizens, which, because the Kingdom of the Netherlands is a member of the European Union, means that these Dutch Caribbeans are also Europeans. So in the end, there are 6 Caribbean islands, 4 countries, 12 provinces, 2 Hollands, 2 Netherlands, and 1 kingdom, all Dutch.
Yeah, great. So, it's funny, right? It's funny because it's Dutch and Dutch things are funny. But like, I don't know how well you guys understand what's happening in Ukraine, but there's a video like this about that, right? Like, I don't know how well your kids understand what's going on in the world, but sometimes you gotta feel like, I wish I could just inject about 10 minutes of history in their head so that they would know what the F they're talking about. The internet will do this for you, right? And also, we'll do this for you, because the thing is, like, as teachers, you're also having to constantly be learning. And so something that is fun and in your subject matter or on current events that will actually help you in your greater goal as not just being educators, but also being fundamentally role models in the lives of these children, this is all very important stuff. So, aside from YouTube, the internet also has a lot of great stuff to help you as educators. I mean, there's really obvious things, right? Like the Khan Academy and Coursera and things like that. I mean, I'm sure that you've heard of these things that are basically trying to put you all out of business, right? But then there's also things like Wikipedia, right? We take things like this for granted. There was no Wikipedia when we were all going to school, at least not anybody who's my age. Maybe some of you are younger than me, and you've always had Wikipedia. I did not have Wikipedia. And Google, I mean, wow, what a fundamental skill is using Google. And yet there are still schools out there that will fail you if they catch you using Google. Even though using Google is probably, like, as an engineer, my #1 skill, right? Because as an engineer, the #1 thing I don't want to be doing is engineering, because that's expensive. So I want to use other engineers' knowledge, and that's why I Google it first. And then, of course, things like Project Gutenberg, right? I mean, this to me, it frustrates me so much when I hear people say they had a bunch of iPads, they didn't know what to do with them, they're sitting in a closet somewhere. Okay, look, if you have an iPad or any other tablet, fill it with books, just books, right? Like, never connect it to the internet, fill it with books, and you're already a leap ahead of what it was like when I was going to school. When I was going to school, I had to strap 20 kilos of books to my back and walk around with it like this all the time, and I could never put it down because it's the United States, and they think that if you have a locker, you're going to put a bomb in it or drugs, and so therefore, I had to carry it on my back all the time, which made me want to not carry my books, which made me suck in school. All of the books in the whole world will fit on this thing, right? Like, when I went to college, I was an English major, but I had to switch to journalism because I couldn't afford the books. They're all free, right? And I could just carry them around like this. You can't think of a use for this in your classroom? Just use it like a book, right? And if you're like, well, why don't we just use Kindles? Fine, use Kindles, I don't care. The point is, all the books in the world, holy crap, that's amazing. That is amazing right there. These things are also really durable, by the way. I don't know if you ever noticed that. So the iPad provides access to the internet and therefore access to all of these things that really have nothing to do with the iPad per se. But there are other things that the iPad is good at. And I use the iPad because Apple, but this is also generally true of all tablets, right? The internet, yeah, great. The internet is great. Having access to the internet is great. But like, the other thing is, you know, you have email, you have iMessage, you have FaceTime, you have related technologies. Just the fact that when your kids leave your classroom, they don't cease to exist in your universe anymore, right? You can keep up with them, you can keep in touch with them, right? You can talk to their parents, right? Somebody's sick at home, you can beam yourself into where they are, right? No longer does somebody have to like get up and leave their job and come here to the classroom to talk to you about their shitty kid. You can just email them. That is such a huge thing. And I mean, I'm sure in a small, relatively wealthy country like Denmark, maybe it's no problem having things like internet access, but for some places, when that kid gets an iPad, that is their family getting the internet. And that is not a small thing. That is a massive, massive thing. The other thing about these is that they're totally customizable and they're totally controllable, right? Like Apple in particular is very, very keen on making sure that you can put this into the hand of a child at any age and they will be safe, right? You can put your controls on here to make sure that they're only used in the prescribed way. But more importantly, this is programmable by dudes like me. Anything you want this to be, this can be. Right? I don't think of this as a tiny computer. I think of this as a primitive nano colony. Right? What do you want? A book? No problem. Piano? No problem. This will be anything because it's a big configurable thing. That's all a computer is. It's just a big box of switches so that you can turn it into anything you want. Yeah, educational software. When we really start to get into the iPad versus just what's available on the internet, you really start to get into stuff that people have made for this, specifically for the purpose of helping you educate and helping people learn. And interactive books is another thing, right? Like I said, if you just put plain old Project Gutenberg out of copyright books on there, it would already be a miracle. But the fact is, if you make a book for this thing, then you can really do some things that are really quite crazy. And this was, I think, one of the very first uses for this. And we're kind of going in a kind of a chronological order here. So I'm gonna show a bit of this behind the scenes look into a book called The Elements. Are you all familiar with The Elements? No? Oh, well then, you're gonna have your minds blown. The Elements is great, and this is the story of a dude who was obsessed with elements and wanted to bring his love of elements to people around the world, to students, and just evolved with the technology in order to bring that love. So his name is Theodore Gray, and let's meet him a little bit.
I've been interested in elements for quite a long time. Back in about 2002, it was kind of an accident. I ended up building this periodic table. It's an actual table, but it's also a periodic table. It's got all the different elements in it. It's got these tiles that represent each element. And ever since then, I've been sort of collecting things to put on this table. Elements. This is antimony, right? It's made of antimony. It's also a Fu-Line and incense burner. This is 5-9 titanium, very pure. This is a lovely bottle of mercury, incredibly heavy stuff. It's metal, but it's liquid. This is a wonderful bismuth crystal, very colorful. I really like this stuff. I think it's very exciting, it's very interesting. This is the stuff that we're all made of, the building blocks of the universe. And ever since I started collecting these objects, I've been trying to figure out how to communicate to people what's so wonderful about them. Early on, of course, I started off with a website. What else would you do? I had periodictable.com for a long time. Then I got a much better URL, periodictable.com. And it's got lots of pictures and photographs and videos, and you can see all these objects. But it's still not, it's not the actual things. So I started thinking, what else can I do? How else can I communicate about these objects? So I started, printing some products, making some things you could actually buy. Here's a periodic table poster. I put this up in your classroom. You got huge pictures of all the elements. It's pretty nice, but it's kind of flat. I made these placemats. The kids love these things. You can buy them in science museums all over the place. Big pictures. Stories on the back, but again, kind of flat. Could do better. So this is a 3D version of that placemat. It's a lenticular 3D print. Everything kind of pops off the page. This is getting pretty nice. It's three-dimensional. That's good, but it's kind of small. Next thing I did was this book. This is a really nice book. It's published by Black Dog and Leventhal. You can find it in bookstores everywhere, and it is a picture book of the elements. You've got every element gets its own page, well, 2 pages, big pictures, small pictures, lots of objects. All this stuff here is all the stuff in my office is in the book, like bismuth. You've got, here's the real thing, here's the picture of it. It's a nice picture. but you know, it's still flat. And what about the other side? The other side's pretty interesting too. So I'm excited now to be able to show you what I think is absolutely the best thing yet in terms of communicating to people what makes this interesting. And that is the Apple iPad version of this Elements book. Let's start it up here. So this is basically an ebook, and in the sense that it's an electronic version of that book. But it's not like any ebook that you've seen before. It's not just sort of an electronic version of paper that's kind of stuck on the screen somehow. Instead, it's really taking advantage of this new medium. So for example, you see here the periodic table, but it's a periodic table where everything is rotating. All these objects are turning around so you can see them from all different sides. In particular, like the bismuth crystals right there. Let's go look at that. So we click on it here, and here we've got a huge, filling up the whole screen version of this crystal, and you can see the back side of it, which you couldn't see before. And we got a bunch of other things too. You see these pages? Looks pretty much like the paper book. It's the same nicely composed page. It's got the same objects on it, and they're kind of arranged, and they look good. But these are all not just pictures. These are sort of magical versions, because I can take them and spin them, every one of these, at the same time. I can take a couple of fingers and take two of these and independently rotate each one. I can take all of my fingers. I can kind of wipe them all, get them all spinning. This is the magic of multi-touch technology. And let's see just how close I can get to showing you what this object looks like in reality. Double tap on it here. And now we get it big, full screen. That's good. It's actually almost life size. But I can do even better than that. I can tap here, and now I've got a stereo 3D version of this object, which I can rotate with my finger. And using a pair of these inexpensive 3D glasses, which you can buy from our website, you can actually look at this, and wow, it pops off the screen in actual live 3D, which I can control with my finger while I'm looking at it in 3D. And I think it's fair to say that is about as close as you can get in terms of a virtual object to the real thing. I can't give you the weight of it, although iPad weighs about as much as this thing. I can't give you the texture, but a 3D object that you can pick up and rotate fluidly under your finger, I think that's about as close as you can get. Let's look at a few other things that this ebook does. So you've got these pages, and you can, let's go back to the home page and pick another element. Let's pick copper. It's one of my favorites. Again, we get the nice, big, beautiful thing. And you see the data here. We've got this interesting data. The same physical properties and such are in the printed book, too. But here, we can actually go much farther, because this book includes an embedded version of the Wolfram Alpha computational knowledge engine, as it's called. Let's click here and see what does Alpha know about copper. And it turns out Alpha knows a lot about copper. These are all sorts of properties way beyond what's in the printed version of the book. And even for some of the properties that you might think are in here, like melting point, let's look at melting point, it tells us a bunch more, not just what it is in Celsius, but in all sorts of different units. What color does it look like if you have something at that temperature, glowing at the temperature of molten copper? Lots of fascinating stuff in the background. And of course, for each element, there's the second page, where we have these virtual objects, including this lovely rotatable dragon, that you can see the real thing, you can see the 3D version of it, you can see the stereo 3D version. Let's go take a look at how we actually create these objects. So we're going to give you a little tour now of the studio.
All right, we'll skip the part where he gives the tour of the studio, but suffice it to say, kind of amazing, right?
I think that Danish students are so used to IT technology and internet, so they would find this boring.
It's possible, but you have to understand that that book is 5 years old. That is not the forefront of technology, that is the very beginning. It's like the first time somebody tried to make a book on the iPad that wasn't just a piece of paper. That's what I think is really amazing about it. And I mean, just like as a book of all the elements, like compared to that, that's really what it's about, right? I mean, compared to that, that's not something that's really relatable. whereas that's a bunch of objects. And so, I made the point earlier about there being only a slight overlap between the people who are educators and the people who are entertainers, and I think that it gets even harder when you're talking about technology because the people who are technologists are a smaller overlap still. And ideally, you're trying to find somebody who really falls into the middle of all three, and that becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult, but luckily the thing about technology is it enables us to basically productize it and distribute it. So you don't need that many people who are like this